This is the Bryant Roche Show, and since the last time I saw you, a lot has happened in the sporting world. I attended the Players, I attended March Madness, where Fletcher McGee in Jacksonville broke the all-time career Division I record for three-point shots made. And along the way this week, I know you've heard about it. I'm sure you've heard about it. The legend, both on and off the field, Rob Gronkowski, decided to call it a career. For me, one of the greats to do it in the business. And throughout the last couple days or so, the conversation is, where does Rob Gronkowski stack up? Is he the greatest to ever do it? Is he one of the best to do it? Where does he fall in the pantheon of tight ends, so to speak? Right now, I've decided in this first segment to take you through some of the factors that I consider important when trying to figure out this discussion, and really when thinking about it is a very difficult judgment to make. But at least in the next several minutes or so during this segment, I just want to go in and at least try to help you make a decision for yourself. And along the way, maybe you'll learn something, maybe you'll figure something out. But anyway, I hope that in this segment, at least you're enlightened in terms of the history of the NFL's great tight ends. So some of the factors that I came up with in making this decision, or at least helping you try to make this decision. My first one, always when determining the passing game, football in general, number one, the Mel Blount rule that came into effect in the 1970s. Folks that are unfamiliar, the Mel Blount rule made it to where you could only give a player one chuck at that 5-yard mark. This rule in general opened up the passing game, created more offense, more scoring in general. So for me, whenever I judge a quarterback, a receiver, and for that matter, the defenders that come into play here, which really trickles down to the corners, the safeties, the linebackers, some other rules in place in terms of grabbing with the offensive and defensive line around the same time also bear to mind for me as well. But in terms of this particular rule, really also a factor for tight ends, obviously pass catchers, and obviously the Mel Blount rule, a major impact on how you view tight ends. My number two thing to consider when looking at this list, mainly the thing that in the old tradition of choosing all pro teams, and really not even that, but just in terms of how you determine the positions in football. In the early days, they didn't necessarily distinguish a end in terms of a tight end and a split end, or a wide receiver, to use more modern vernacular. So something to keep in mind there. Just the fact that when you look at old all-pro teams, in many situations, you'll have to really do your homework in terms of determining whether they're what we would consider a pure tight end, a wide receiver, or one or the other. Number three, the use of tight end split out versus the traditional tight end. So in terms of the traditional tight end, I'll define that as an inline tight end, a guy that'll get in a three-point stance. He'll line up next to the tackle on offense. And the split, what I'll call a tight end that's split out, a guy that is not next to the tackle in a three-point stance. Instead, he's in more of a receiver stance, and he'll be split out wide. Also something to consider, a third type of guy, more of an H-back type, that'll line up behind the line, actually, as more of a back/fullback type player. Sometimes in football circles, we'll call these sniffers. We'll call these guys wings. In our present day, more of an H-back type. But those three different places where a tight end can line up definitely make a difference in terms of evaluating these guys in general. And number 4, the way that tight ends have been used over time. So for me, judging a player from the 60s onward, one of the tasks in making this decision, the amount of times they were throwing the ball, who their quarterbacks were in general, the coaching philosophies, some of the innovations that have changed the game over time, and obviously the players coming from the 60s and for part of the 70s, the bulk of the 70s, the major pass rules weren't in place. The Mel Blount rule already mentioned. Alright, so where I start this timeline for me, it really starts in the 1960s, mainly for that last reason in particular, the use of tight ends changing over the course of time. For me, this list, for our purposes, will not start. The candidates for the great ones for me will not start until the 1960s. And really, for me, it starts with Mike Ditka. Mike Ditka played for the Bears from 61 to 66. Had a brief stint with the Eagles for a couple of years, and then played the tail end of his career with the Dallas Cowboys. For me, he had arguably the greatest rookie season of this bunch. He came right onto the scene, playing for George Halas's Bear teams of the early 60s. In 1961, he started his career off with 1,076 yards, which really was unheard of for a tight end at the time, averaging 19.2 yards per catch, and accrued 12 touchdowns in that spectacular season. Really, when you're talking about early tight ends, or in the early 1960s, I should say, Ditka is the guy for me that stands out. To describe his playing style, 6'3", listed at 228, 230-ish, give or take, in his heavier days. So in terms of his size, during that era, he was plenty big enough. Although, in today's standards, he probably would look undersized, but in that era, he was not. Really, when I look at the film of this guy, he's not only a pass catcher like a lot of these other guys on this list, or at least some of the guys that I would consider as the great ones. For me, Ditka is the type of guy, as a former player, I would do battle with. A great blocker along the line of scrimmage, a guy that not only run blocked, but actually was also a very good pass blocker when you look at the film. He was the type of guy that at the tight end position, he could block a defensive end if called upon to, but maybe even more so, something that I think separates him from guys on this list is his willingness to hustle, his willingness to run downfield. During the 1963 season, which, by the way, was the year that the Bears won the NFL championship, this happening, one of the rare occasions where the Packers did not come out on top during this era, but it was the Bears that won the championship on that particular team in that particular year. And Ditka, on a particular play, his team, on a particular pass play, his teammate catches the ball downfield, and Ditka hustles, running full speed, absolutely nails, and the announcer on the clip says that he demolished Bobby Boyd on this play. And when I mean it, I freaking oohed and awed when I saw this hit. And Ditka was not a stranger to this. Gale Sayers, joining the club later on in his career, talked about Ditka running down the field, blocking, doing anything he could for his team on a particular play. They called him Iron Mike. He was really known for his toughness throughout his career, even going back to his days as a college player at Pittsburgh. And for me, just an all-around tough, physical player in that era, a tough time to play football, and he's surely among the top when considering his toughness. In terms of other notes regarding Ditka, the strengths have already really been talked about in terms of both his pass catching and his blocking ability. But I think mainly the weakness for people that maybe would not consider him the greatest of all time would probably be the fact that after several years of performing, his body started to wear and tear from the physical nature of his style. A guy that definitely did not avoid contact, a guy that blocked, a willing blocker. So really the critique, or maybe not so much the critique, but the thing that will probably keep some people from considering him the best was probably the fact that his body just broke down at a certain point, and after several years of really being the best tight end during that era, in the early 60s, his body just broke down on him. Late in his career, he had a touchdown pass for the Cowboys, a nice Super Bowl moment. In 1972, the 1971 team, so it was the team that beat the Dolphins, who, yes, the Dolphins the next year went undefeated, etc., etc., but Ditka serving on those early 70s Cowboys teams as well. Not what he was from a tangible physical standpoint like he was earlier in his career in Chicago, but a valuable part in terms of the intangibles and what he could bring from a veteran standpoint in the later portion of his career. Now, what happened during that time in general, the 1960s, you have probably the position, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say, in general, when talking about the different positions in football, I think more than any other, I saw in terms of videos, in terms of written accounts, really any source of media or publication, I think more guys than at any other position have had claims of, quote, revolutionizing the position. So when you think about that, in my opinion, it starts with Ditka, but because of the various styles of play, these other guys you can't forget either. Throughout the 60s, you can think of guys, in addition to Ditka, think of a guy like Jackie Smith for the Cardinals, but really, when it got to it, starting in the mid-60s after Ditka, maybe his body broke down a little bit, I think the next great one that could be in the discussion for the greatest ever is John Mackey. He played for the Baltimore Colts in the 60s and into the early 70s. What he brought to the table, he was 6'2", listed at about 225, but I think his stocky build, he looks a little bigger on film. He could run with anybody, and when I mean that, he was a 4-5 guy at the tight end position at a time when tight ends usually either were too bulky to run at that pace or simply just weren't that fast. Really, a guy like Mackey normally would probably be a running back or a fullback, probably a fullback, but he was used as a tight end, and what he brought to the table was that he was probably the greatest tight end, pretty much undisputably so, in terms of yards after catch, in terms of breaking tackles after catching the football, in terms of big play capability. During his career, just to give you some numbers, he had touchdowns rather, of 51, 52, 54, 56, 57, 58, 61, 75, 79, 83, and 89 yards. The last of these was the longest of Johnny Unitas' career. Obviously, Johnny U, a great player in NFL history, one of the greatest guys to throw the pigskin. But for Mackey, the rub is this: the big play after the catch, his 75-yard touchdown in their Super Bowl win against the Cowboys in what was known as the Blunder Bowl. He caught a pass that was tipped in the air, camped under it, and had a 75-yard touchdown in that game, using his speed, and simply broke away after catching the tip ball. What analysts will often use against him, they'll say that he was more of a body catcher than a guy that had good hands. This quote actually coming from Johnny Unitas, his own quarterback, quote, "If you threw the ball at that wall would have just as good a chance of catching it as John Mackey." And then he later continued, "No, Mackey was a hell of an athlete. Johnny was a smart guy, too. And he was a good guy, but he had board hands. He had hands like a toilet seat." So really, what you get out of that is that Mackey, certainly in terms of what he could do with the ball once he possessed it, really one of the greatest ever. At the tight end position, I'm going to say that he was the greatest ever in terms of turning it around and running. He had a particular play against the Detroit Lions where, by my count, he broke at least 7 tackles. If you watch the film, he catches the ball, and really almost the entire Lions defense comes around to him, and none of them can tackle on this long touchdown run. He had two seasons of 20-plus yards per reception, 5-time Pro Bowler, and interestingly enough, it was Mackey who said, in his opinion, the best team he played on lost the Super Bowl, talking about the team that lost to the Jets in Super Bowl III, and he said one of his worst won the Super Bowl. So I always thought that was interesting. So Mackey, for me, the 15.8 yards per catch definitely sticks out. His ability to take the ball and take it all the way, it was probably the greatest ever. So for me, my second candidate for potential greatest of all time is John Mackey, and really the only stickler is that his hands, he had occasional drops with his hands, although the quote earlier from Unitas itself does maybe exaggerate the view of him to an extent, in that he really was dependable in terms of bringing it into his body. Alright, and into the 60s, 70s, you had a number of guys that really had an impact from the tight end position. But for my list, in terms of the greatest of all time, your next solid candidate is Dave Casper from the Raiders. Dave Casper, they called him the Ghost because of his pale look. He was 6'4", 240, went to Notre Dame, was a tackle who converted to the tight end position. And really what sets Dave Casper apart, and yes, I have watched film on him, is really his combination of blocking and his ability to get separation, and really one of the best pair of hands I've ever seen. Casper, the knock on him, maybe that he wasn't particularly fast. For me, definitely not as fast as Mackey. I would definitely say slower than Ditka in his prime by my estimation. Slower than some of the modern tight ends that have come through that I'll mention later. Really a type of guy who, when you look at him, I don't think that you're going to see him and say that he looks the most athletic of the guys that are on this list. But for me, Casper, really a technician on the line of scrimmage. And what he brought to the table is this: a big game performer. And he had several playoff moments that stood out, several moments in general. You have the ghost to the post, a memorable play in football lore. You have the holy roller, the ball that just kept bouncing and ricocheting until Casper finally settled under it for a big touchdown against the Chargers in a particular game. What he did from a receiving standpoint, he wasn't particularly fast, like I said, but when I watched him on the film, he had this knack for gaining separation despite that lack of speed. A very impressive possession receiver, very reliable hands. He played for the Raiders during the era of Stabler. Fred Biletnikoff was a receiver during the time when he played. Both of them, two of the best pair of hands ever on the same team. Casper, an all-around tight end, great hands, excellent blocker. If you want to give me a guy that does both things, I might rank him really as high as anybody on this list in terms of being able to do both things, as both a blocker and a pass catcher, combining maybe not necessarily the big playability of a Mackey or even some of the other players that have come in more contemporary times. But for me, he also had 13.8 yards per reception, which in general speaks to the fact that he could get that separation. So even without that speed, he still had some big play in him, and he was awesome in terms of moving the chains and making big money catches. For me, that is why Dave Casper is high in terms of greatest of all time tight end consideration. He did it all, and of course, how do you not like the nickname, the Ghost? Now, going in from the late 70s onward to the 1980s, the guy that stands out to me in the 80s, there are a couple really good ones, but for me, the best of the 80s was Kellen Winslow Sr., the Chargers tight end. Really, in terms of the guys that revolutionized the position, Kellen Winslow, certainly a guy that comes to mind. Played really to set the scene out for you. This was a guy who arrived just after the Mel Blount rule was in place. So you think about guys like Mackey or Ditka, Mackey, guys that really their pass catching numbers were really limited, relatively speaking, because of the Mel Blount rule. Linebackers could hit you at any time going over the middle. Really, in general, linebackers had a lot more power in terms of covering guys because they could hit you. But now, because of that 5-yard rule, linebackers can't quite get away with what they used to. But anyway, Winslow, after that Mel Blount rule, he arrives. Don Coryell, really an innovator in terms of coaching. Joe Gibbs was also on that staff. so you set the scene for really more of a spread out NFL. After he arrived in the league, you also had concepts like the West Coast offense and whatnot arrive. But for him, playing in the Air Coryell offense, which really, if you ask me, in terms of offenses in the NFL, really the West Coast offense and Air Coryell are pretty much the two dominant concepts that have lasted since the time of the Mel Blount rule. Those two offenses are really the ones that have carried the day and that are really present in the National Football League. But anyway, what you had with Winslow is this. You had a big body, 6'5", 251, big dude, who they used as a guy that they could split out wide. Some people during that time, I've read even New Thinking Man's Guide by Paul Zimmerman, Dr. Z, really a great work on football in the NFL in terms of how things were, etc. And a lot of people during that era complained that he wasn't an inline tight end all the time. They split him out wide. Gibbs used him in trips. He put him in different spread formations. But the fact of the matter was this. At his size, at 6'5", 250-ish, he was just too big for defensive backs and too athletic for linebackers. And during that period in the early 80s, really his rookie season wasn't anything really to write home about in 79. But in the 80s, in the early 80s in particular, he launched a period where he had 3 first-team All-Pro selections from 80 to 82, a 5-time Pro Bowler in that decade. And thinking about his numbers, these are some numbers for me that stand out. In 1980, he had nearly 1,300 yards and 9 TDs. 1981, 1,075 and 10 TDs. In 83, 1,172 and 8 TDs. Keep in mind the 82 season in just 9 games, because 82 was a strike season. In 9 games, he had 721 yards and 6 touchdowns. So if you factor in the shortened season because of the strike, really in terms of NFL history, you have to consider the strike. You have to consider the other strike that took place later in the decade as well. But think about the strike in this particular season as well, even more so, just 9 games. So you factor that in, you give him a full schedule, and Winslow probably has 4 consecutive seasons with over 1,000 yards, something that was really unprecedented, although you do factor in the 16-game schedule for most of his career. That was different than, per se, some of the guys before him that only played in 12 or 14. But anyway, in terms of production, no one produced like this guy in his era, without a doubt the top tight end of his era, which really bolsters his resume. The problem is this, and this is why he isn't, in my opinion, like an undisputed greatest of all time. Even though there are many other great ones, this is really the reason why, for Winslow, the one drawback, if you will, is the fact that, and I don't even know if it's fair to call it a drawback, but here's why he maybe didn't quite produce over the long haul like he maybe could have. It happened in a particular game in 1984. At the time, he was on pace, record pace, I believe. 55 receptions for 663 yards were his stats for 1984. But in the 7th game, he had a knee injury where a Raider player tackled him, a severe injury that cost him the rest of the year. So if you consider that injury in 84, In 85, he wasn't the same. You really keep going, and without that knee at full strength, he just wasn't the same in general. So for me, the period of excellence that he had the potential to bring was shortened largely because of that injury, and not just any injury, a pretty significant knee injury that really cost him a shot of later years of production, or at the very least could have maybe added some production to his career. Still, though, even with that said, many still consider him the greatest tight end just in terms of what he could do, the athleticism that he possessed in his prime. He came back in 87 for another Pro Bowl caliber year, but in general, just wasn't the same guy after that knee injury. You talk about a performance for the ages, the epic in Miami, the game that no one should have lost, 166 yards in a big-time performance in a 1982 playoff game. This was the 1981 season, but the playoff game obviously happening in the new year. He had that 166 yards, was the record for yards in a playoff game until Vernon Davis came along and broke it in 2012 when he had 180 in a game. Winslow, a member of the 75th anniversary team, so him and Ditka were the tight ends chosen for that team, by the way. So Kellen Winslow, things to keep in mind: a specimen of an athlete at his size, very unusual, couldn't be covered by defensive backs, simply too athletic for linebackers. The main gripe for some people is that he wasn't much of an inline player. He was split out wide a lot, and obviously the knee injury put a damper on being at the top of his game for a longer period. So for me, going into the 90s, the top two tight ends of the 90s were probably Ben Coates and Shannon Sharpe. You probably know Shannon Sharpe, or at least some of the younger members of this audience may know him more for arguing with Skip Bayless every morning. But actually, during a period in the 1990s, Shannon Sharpe was actually a very reliable receiver for John Elway and the Denver Broncos. What he brought to the table: he was an 8-time Pro Bowler, 4-time first-team All-Pro, member of the All-Decade team in the 1990s. In terms of his attributes, his skill set, definitely more of a speedster than a big body. Only weighed about maybe 225 or 230. Listed at 6'2". He could break one open, other than maybe Mackey. In terms of speed and breaking it open that way, I think you have to consider him among the top in that discussion. What he lacked, though, in my opinion, was probably an excellent or a skill set of being an excellent blocker. Because he wasn't big, really when you see him on film, as good as he was in terms of his receiving ability, as a blocker, he just wasn't big enough to be an elite blocker in more modern times. At that size, at 6'2", and only about 225, 230, in this time frame, more modern contemporary times, he just wasn't nearly big enough when matched up against elite defensive ends. And he looks even smaller on tape when you see him next to a guy like Gary Zimmerman, who during that era was one of the best offensive tackles in the game for Denver. And for me, Sharpe, the achievements as a receiver are great, but for me, I think he is a notch below some of the other guys on this list. I have him on this list because for me, he was the top player during the 90s. So for me, if you are the best during your particular era, you deserve props, you deserve recognition. But I think maybe the lack of overall blocking from a size standpoint. Sometimes on tape you saw him chop block. Really, I thought he did that partially because he wasn't big enough to get guys head on. But I do admire him for being in the trenches. He wasn't purely a guy that split out wide, even though he wasn't particularly huge. They also put him on the line. So for me, I give him props for his toughness, his overall physicality. But for me, in a sense, he just wasn't as big as some of the more modern tight ends, and for that reason, I don't think he is a GOAT. Although for me, certainly deserving of being in Canton for his big playability, definitely a 1,000-yard receiver in his heyday, routinely. Helped John Elway a lot in his later years as he made that 90s climb in age. A valuable part on 3 Super Bowl teams, the 2 Denver ones late in the 90s, as well as the Ravens team in the early 2000s. Also, major props coming out of Savannah State. Big time, if you ask me. So for that, Shannon Sharpe, you are on this show. Maybe not the greatest of all time, but you are a mention for me. Now, here's where things really get interesting in terms of Gronkowski, where he is in terms of the modern spectrum. You think about the 2000s, several guys that come to mind in me. Basically, when you get to the 2000s, that's my childhood. That's my time frame. And for me growing up, the best of the bunch was Tony Gonzalez. A Pro Bowler year after year, 14 times in fact, in terms of longevity, in terms of a continued level of excellence. Tony Gonzalez is by far the best in that regard with his 14-time Pro Bowlers, Pro Bowl appearances, which you add up all the career numbers, the all-time leader in receiving yards for a tight end, over 15,000. Most receptions for a tight end, 1,325. You consider the consistency. For me, something that stands out is the consistency that he had despite the many coaching changes and overall change in Kansas City that took place while he played for the Chiefs from 97 to 2008. A quick review for some of you that either don't know or forget. His career started in the late 90s during the Marty Schottenheimer era. Schottenheimer, a lot of success, but in 98 he left there. Then you go into the Gunther Cunningham era, 99 to 2000. The next major era for Gonzalez, the Dick Vermeil era, which for me was probably the era where he had his most, in terms of individual statistical success, I'll say the Dick Vermeil era from 2001 to 2005 was probably his best one, if not so. During that time frame, Al Saunders was the offensive coordinator. And then from 2006 to 2008, you have the Herm era, and obviously things didn't go so well for the team during the Herm era. You had a lot of different quarterbacks that came through the wings as well. You talk about Trent Green, who was probably the best one before he joined Matty Ice in Atlanta. You think of guys like Damon Heward. You think of guys like Brody Croyle, Matt Castle. a lot of different faces took the snaps in Kansas City. So even so, you had a running game that for me was great when he first got there, or at least after a couple years when you factor in Priest Holmes, Larry Johnson, a big body back. But after a while, I would say the team increasingly from an offensive overall standpoint dipped, and he dipped with them going to Atlanta. He had a little resurgence in Atlanta, if you will. And for me, Tony Gonzalez, after all those years, 4 times he had over 1,000 yards. Yes, partially inflated with the modern rules, but you consider the excellence. For me, the only guy that really the 2 guys that gave him a running during his prime were Antonio Gates and Jason Witten. For the most part, Gates, the only present guy on my list, him and Witten really during the 2000s-ish, I'd probably say Witten and Gates. I'd probably say Witten was more of an all-around tight end, probably a better blocker than Gates. Gates was probably more productive in terms of receiving overall if you count the entire career. And really, Gates was the guy who, during Gonzalez's prime, gave him the biggest run for his money in terms of all pro selections going through the mid-2000s, if you ask me. But Gonzalez was the best tight end of the 2000s, and for me, during what I consider my childhood, before Gronkowski was the greatest tight end. And now, going in, last but not least, I buried the lead a little bit, but the life of the party in the NFL, Rob Gronkowski, the guy who just retired, here's what he brought to the table. Really, in my opinion, after Witten, the most complete tight end in terms of both blocking and catching. And going back further, I might go back as far as Casper in terms of being an all-around tight end that could do it all. Next, you think about what he did in terms of being Brady's best receiver really for the last I don't quite want to say decade, but for the past 8 or 9 years or so. But the problem was, and really the significant knock on Gronkowski was his injury-prone legacy. You think about all the different injuries that he accrued during his career, which probably came with the tough physical nature that he brought to the table. So really, it might be one of those things where you couldn't have one or the other. You had to have both. And in Gronkowski's situation, he played hard, but he also got hurt in the process. But really, Gronkowski, in terms of playoff performance, a big-time performer against the Eagles, even in defeat. I thought that Gronkowski was really the main cog. Brady broke the record for passing yards, but Gronkowski was the guy that the Eagles couldn't stop in that football game. In this Super Bowl, this past season, he caught the big catch toward the end of the game when the score is 3-3. He caught the ball in the red zone that put the Patriots in position to score late against the Rams this season. In terms of other legacy notes, he was known for partying hard. He also got a little beef after they lost the 2012 Super Bowl to the Giants. He got caught on tape clubbing. Whatever your take on that. Some players that I played with would get too pissed and just couldn't party. Other guys liked to party because it put their mood in a better place. So yeah, I mean, different guys I played with did different things, and part of your judgment on that probably has to do with how you would react. Are you the type of guy that likes to get your sorrows away from you? Or are you the type of guy that just is so pissed that you won't do anything kind of thing? In Gronkowski's situation there, he felt like partying, I guess, was the best remedy. in a sense, a very smart football player, and really in every aspect, just an all-around great tight end. And I think the legacy will be this. I think he'll be, when the 2010s All-Decade team comes out, Gronkowski will no doubt be the tight end selected. And with all the factors that I have, brought to the table here, you consider his place in a modern offense, but at the same time, he wasn't always split out. He was in line as a traditional tight end, a willing blocker, a physical blocker who had the technique. Really, the major knock probably for him was his injury situation. And that injury situation, I think, is really the barrier. The lack of longevity in terms of comparing him to some of the more recent tight ends. I think his longevity probably compares pretty well to some of those earlier guys I mentioned. Guys like Ditka, guys like Mackey, guys that were in the 60s and 70s maybe that didn't have a long prime. But for guys in modern times, you think about him and you place him in the same lens as a guy like Tony Gonzalez, as a guy like Jason Witten, who retired but is now coming back. A guy like Antonio Gates, who is still in the league, but you got to think that he's probably on his way out. But he sustained such a long period of excellence as well, really up until the last couple of years. He was certainly a very productive player. So for me, looking at this list, the greatest of all time comes down to this: how much do you measure the impact of the Mel Blount rule? Number one. Number two, how much do you measure the other factor of either being a split out tight end, a guy that goes back? For me, the modern split type guys, you think of guys like Tony Gonzalez, Kellen Winslow, obviously the first real one. So for me, you first think of Kellen Winslow, then you think of some other modern guys like Tony Gonzalez, not always solely on the line, although Tony did play in the line on some of the time. Then you think in terms of measuring blocking and pass catching. For me, obviously the blocking isn't quite as easy to judge. You gotta take in long periods of tape. For receiving, I think you don't have to take that long just to discover, does he have good hands? Does he run good routes? For me, blocking is something that takes longer to really focus on. And unless you spent hours watching film, for me, guys like Ditka, in terms of his blocking, it doesn't take me too long to see his hustle, see the drive, see the passion that he played for, and really a guy that left his body on the line when playing the game of football. In terms of maybe guys that were receiver, maybe I might throw in Sharp in terms of maybe more of a receiver type. Guys like Winslow, I probably also do. Although for me, Winslow gets a bit of a bad rap in terms of his blocking. For me, I actually watched the tape, and for me, Winslow was actually a capable blocker when called upon. Really underrated in terms of his blocking technique. Mackey, for me, a guy that was a good blocker despite not being quite as big, although he probably was just as big, if not bigger, than some of his contemporaries. So really in his era he wasn't undersized per se, even though in today's era he probably would be. So for me, Mackey, well-deserving as well in terms of his blocking and pass-catching ability. Really those are the guys to consider for me. In terms of forming a greatest list, do you favor longevity? Do you favor big moments? Paul Zimmerman, a guy that I definitely respect in the industry, he considered Casper his best tight end. For me, it's it's disputable, but if a guy like that considers Casper the greatest, I can't say that I can ignore it. Because for me, Casper really did a lot of things well, and when it was money time for him. So for me, the comp, if I want to comp Gronkowski to somebody, I think Casper might be my comp. So in terms of being a bigger body, in terms of finding separation, maybe not necessarily the fastest guy, but a good blocker, I might put Casper I'll put Casper on maybe a higher. In terms of blocking, I might give Casper a little bit better of a grade. But for Gronk, a bigger body, even though he did play in a later period, a bigger body for Gronk in terms of shielding off guys. But what Casper did is getting that great separation. So for me, that's your list. And for me, it's up to you to decide. So many different factors. For me, in terms of pass catching, I might take different guys depending on the criteria. So really, that's where I'm going. That's the direction I'm taking this thing, and I hope that benefited you in trying to make this decision. All right, folks, and now after a long discussion on the greatest tight ends in this league, I'm now going to turn over to the diamond, where one of the truly great ones, in my mind, the best right fielder of my childhood, called it a career for the Seattle Mariners, his original home, at least his original home in Major League Baseball. Ichiro, for me, there are a lot of things that I will remember. In terms of the national media, I think that he hasn't gotten his due over the last several days or week or so, I guess now. In my opinion, hasn't gotten his due. I've got reasons for that coming up. But what Ichiro did for baseball in Japan simply can't be ignored. In terms of being a five-tool guy, I would say that he definitely had four of them. When you talk about his fielding ability, they called it Area 51 in right field. You consider the cannon for an arm he had. He had a famous throw against the A's where he threw out a guy going to third from deep in right field. Wasn't a big guy by any means, but he had an absolute cannon from right. What people probably most remember him for, though, was his incredible ability at the plate in terms of batting for average, in terms of being a guy that just had single after single, hit after hit, a 2-time batting champion, a 10-time All-Star, 10-time Gold Glove Award winner. Really, those first 10 years were the prime of his career. Obviously, he played the first several in Japan, so for Major League Baseball purposes, those statistics, the career statistics actually might be a little misleading because he spent that large bulk of his career in Japan. When you combine the totals of hits that he had both in America and in Japan, he is the all-time professional baseball leader in hits. He also had the most hits in interleague play, most hits in a season by a rookie. Obviously, being a rookie at an older age, but still, new environment, 242 hits. I don't sneeze at that. 10 consecutive 200-hit seasons. That is an MLB record. He was one of only 2 players ever to be an MVP and a Rookie of the Year. He did that in 2001, the season where the Mariners had a record 116 games won. Also led the AL in stolen bases that season. And with that in mind, he had 56 in that particular year. Reading off these notes, he had 30 plus in every season from 2001 to 2008 and 2010 and 2011. He had 26 in a season where he only played in 146 games in 2009. Keep in mind, at that point, he was 35 years old. He had 29 in 2012 at the age of 38. Batted 350 4 times. Incredible. 4 times, I repeat, 4 times batted 350 plus. I'm talking about 2001, 2004, 2007, and 2009. He was the Silver Slugger Award winner in 2001, 2007, and 2009. This going to the best hitter at your particular position. He was a career 311 hitter, which was great, but a little misleading when you consider all 18 seasons in which he played, especially when you think about the last several where his performance obviously dipped. He was, to give you a better idea of his ability, he batted 331 from 2001 to 2010. This was really the prime of his career, the first 10 seasons in Major League Baseball for him. To rattle off his peak performance, these are the numbers. He played from 2001 to 2010, to clarify. He played in 1,588 games, 6,779 at-bats, contributed 1,047 runs, 2,244 hits, which, by the way, just in a 10-year period, 258 doubles, 71 triples, 558 RBI. Pretty impressive when you consider he's primarily a leadoff hitter. Stolen bases 383, the aforementioned 331 batting average, and an on-base percentage of 376, and an OPS of 806. Pretty impressive when you consider he didn't have a whole lot of power. So for him to have an 806 OPS, pretty impressive when you factor that in. The one thing that people will think of in terms of the power, though, only 90 home runs during that 2001 to 2010 period. So for that, that's probably the main knock in terms of his all-around skill set, was the lack of power. More on that later. Some things to keep in mind that I will always remember. I'll always remember that signature from that left-handed stance, that signature little circular motion when he batted. Then he did the old sleeve tug, and then after that sleeve tug, he had that slap hitting motion where he came out of the box on the left side and just stroked it. The slap hitting thing, definitely a signature in America. Very few slap hitters here. I see it more prevalently in softball, but in terms of baseball, Ichiro was the slap hitter, and for that, I think that's worth noting. As mentioned before, only one of 2 players to be Rookie of the Year and MVP. The other guy was Fred Lynn, by the way, doing so in 1975. Led the league in hits 7 times, 2001, 2004, and every year from 2006 to 2010. And that 7 times is second only to Ty Cobb. Guys named Tony Gwynn and Pete Rose also had that same number. Led the league in at-bats 8 times, which is the all-time record. Also the all-time record for leading the league in singles. I think I wrote that down mainly because those singles really is trademark. He wasn't a power hitter, but he had a lot of singles. And of course, he had that magical season where he broke the hits record, and that record still stands. So, And really a startling statistic. You probably won't find this statistic anywhere else. He averaged a very small 68.3 strikeouts in that first 10 seasons up until the age of 36 that I mentioned earlier. Some other notes about Ichiro that I think are worth noting. Really, all the players during his time mentioned his unusual precision, his unusual level of commitment, work ethic. A specific account mentions that he would go to bed. Before he went to bed, he would always have this 10-minute regimen of swinging the bat before he went to sleep. He had a habit of waking up on mornings and taking extra batting practice from 1 to 4 a.m. in the dark. He had a custom humidor case that kept moisture away from his bat. He did this, very unique of him to do this, but anyway, he kept his equipment monitored, and he would polish his shoes, something his dad taught him. He also took care of his glove too, in the manner that his dad taught him. Some other notes, really his childhood, something that I think is worth noting. As a child, he had this special routine since he was in 3rd grade. Keep in mind, 3rd grade, 365 days a year. His dad had this routine for him where he had 50 pitches, 200 soft toss swings, and 50 fungo drills. And then he went to a local batting cage. Keep in mind he was from Japan, but local for him, where he took about 250 to 300 swings off the pitching machine. So he did all this on a daily basis. In fact, in an article written by ESPN by Wright Thompson, he was actually quoted as saying that the level of work that his father put him through, he said, quote, they bordered on child abuse, which really, in my opinion, was the sad part of all this, was that after a while, the amount of, I guess, the treatment that he received eventually pushed him to the point where his relationship with his dad broke off, which, interestingly enough, he remained dedicated to the sport of baseball, and very interested in the history of the game. A guy that visited the Negro Leagues Hall of Fame, even being from Japan. And they say the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, that among active players, or up until his retirement anyway, among current players, he visited Cooperstown more than anybody else. So he has that love for the game, the mark of history, but certainly a shame that I guess the rigorous routine paid off in terms of his greatness, but at the same time, you hate that treatment that he received resulted in his relationship being scarred. But with that said, going through all the different highlights, I obviously didn't get to mention every single one of them, but for me, the question after all this, and the question that I'm going to answer in a few minutes, was why Ichiro didn't get the love that I think he deserved, being the greatest right fielder of that generation, of my generation, so to speak. For me, here are the main reasons why this story kind of swept under, in my opinion. Number one, happened in the Japan series, so for him it gained probably a lot of local and country coverage, but from a United States standpoint, being in America, a lot of people weren't watching a pair of baseball games that took place on March 20th and 21st at 5:30 a.m. Eastern Time at the Tokyo Dome. Number 2, he retired about 5 years after he could have. For me, his level of excellence spanned for a very long time. I mentioned that 10-year window, but after that window, really his last All-Star appearance, after that, his performance just dipped. His last All-Star appearance being in 2010 at the age of 36. And during that period, he had years in New York from 2012 to 2014, and he had that stint with the Miami Marlins where it just wasn't the same, and no longer playing at an all-star performance, just wasn't relevant to the public eye, wasn't contending for a championship, just wasn't the type of guy that played a key role during those Miami years. He just wasn't relevant. Number 3, and I think a very interesting one, he wasn't a power hitter in a power hitting era. He started his career during the steroid era. Only had 117 home runs in 18 seasons. Very unusual. Kind of Cobb-like, if you ask me. He was almost like a player that you would say is suited for the dead ball era, but he didn't play in the dead ball era. He played in the steroid era. Was the best player in terms of batting for average, but in an era where guys are hitting the long ball during the steroid era, he was just a different player from a different place. And I think the overall nature of his game maybe wasn't quite as powerful in terms of his impact on the game. They say chicks dig the long ball, and Ichiro just didn't hit the long ball very often. And of course the slap hitting factor. He just didn't hit for power. He was a slap hitter, and I think to a degree that just didn't exactly resonate with a lot of people. Number 4, from Japan and drew little attention in terms of just his personalities, in terms of being a low-key guy. I think this number 4, very likely perhaps the biggest reason why, just being from a foreign place, not being a guy that showed up in the media a lot. You didn't see him in commercials. You didn't see him really making a public appearances on a large scale. He was more of a quiet guy, went about his business. There's a story about him actually. It was in an article that I found. But anyway, one of Mike Sweeney's teammates, and I say that because in the article, this particular teammate, the source, wasn't disclosed. But anyway, a remarkable story. Apparently, this guy who played in the major leagues was in Central Park in New York on a particular day, and he walks up, and in the distance, he sees this guy throwing long toss, and he estimated that this guy was throwing some 300 feet away, which for those wondering is a long way. And he goes over and he sees him, and eventually he discovers that this is Ichiro just working alone by himself, throwing a baseball 300 feet, which for me was incredibly interesting. So when you think of all the things that in America, maybe the fact that he was international, played a different style, and probably played more power to him. He loved the game and kept playing. His life revolved around baseball, really, based on the descriptions that I've read. You think about all those things, the fact that he did play longer. He didn't have like a swan song ending where he was at the top of his game like a Gronkowski that I just mentioned where he had a big catch in the Super Bowl. Ichiro never had that playoff moment. He never had that World Series. And really for the past several years, he's really hasn't quite been the same. So from that standpoint, when you have that prominence and it dips over a 5-year period, really memories lose sight of things quickly. And I think that 5-year period or so can't be underestimated in addition to the other factors. And with that being said, though, for Japanese people, this guy really was an idol. This guy was a hero. For baseball players, a guy in that country that made a tremendous impact. Just a couple of quotes here. This from Marley Rivera of ESPN. A couple of quotes that shed light on just how good he was and the impact that he had. Quote from Yu Darvish, pitcher for the Chicago Cubs. Ichiro is the most famous person in Japan. He is like a god, and that's why it's huge for Japanese fans. Yusei Kikuchi. I hope I pronounced that right, but pitcher for the Mariners currently. Mr. Ichiro is like a god in Japan. I think all of Japan is looking forward to watching Ichiro. Obviously, he said that just before it happened. And I am one of those fans. So on that note, Ichiro signing off. Now, after this great show, I'll sign off. Best, Bryant Roche.